The meeting finished at the 70-minute mark, and from the 20-minute mark to the 70-minute mark, ironically, I didn't listen to a word that was being said. What I was doing was writing down with a pen and paper and figuring out how many weeks of salary I've got left before I run out of cash. As I collected my laptop and writing equipment, I started to step out the door, and Tracy said, "Oscar, please close the door because what I have to say is really important and it needs to be said in private." So I closed the door and I walked back, and she looked me in the eyes as I was about 5 steps from the door, and she said, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And I thought, awesome. I'm getting fired and I don't even know why. I sat down. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world."
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. I'm your host, Dov Baron. The world is loud with opinions and advice. True listening has become a rare superpower that transforms ordinary interactions into deeply insightful exchanges. Yet most of us overestimate our listening prowess, missing the words and the silence between them where the messages are really held. Would you dare to challenge your own listening abilities? Well, join us for this revelatory 2-episode journey with Oscar Trimboli. He is the acclaimed author of the international bestseller, How to Listen, and the previous one, Breakthroughs, How to Confront Assumptions. Oscar brings his wealth of knowledge to unraveling the layers of true listening. This is the Dov Baron Show, where curiosity meets profound insights. Tap into our community of deeply curious listeners by hitting that subscribe button right now. This is not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Every episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. For the next 2 episodes, we're going to dive into the neuroscience behind listening. How do our brains process what we hear in different settings, from intimate face-to-face conversations to digital echoes of virtual meetings? Oscar will guide us through the subtle art of hearing, the unsaid, and understanding the unspoken. Tuning in, it's not just about your ears, it's about listening with your heart and your mind. This isn't just learning to listen, it's mastering the art of understanding. So, turn up the volume and help me to welcome, all the way from Australia, very early in the morning, the acclaimed author of international bestseller, How to Listen. He's also the recipient of an award from Apple for the original content for his podcast called Deep Listening. Mr. Oscar Trimboli. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Dov. Thank you for the generous introduction and the thought that went behind it. There's a lot of threads you're pulling together there. Really diverse listening taking place already, I can see.
Thank you, sir. That's very kind. So where I always like to start the show is the same place, which is context. It's very easy to assume someone is who they are. They've always been that person. And we know that that's just not the case. We have a background. We have a history. And I have found that people tend to make their life's work out of something from their history that impacted them. So what's the emotional source code of Oscar that gives us context for what we should be listening to?
Yeah, there's 2 doorways that I passed through to get there. When I was a teenager, I had a werewolf jaw. So put your fist together and put it in front of your face and put it as close to your teeth as possible. That's how far my jaw was protruding. What does it mean? Like every other teenager of my age with something wrong with their jaw, some kind of braces. Most people have braces for 1 or 2 years. Mine was probably double that. Well, what it meant was I didn't want to draw attention to myself.
No.
So I got really good at being in the background. And when somebody wanted to talk to me, I got really good at asking questions. That being in the background, you started to notice how people interacted without necessarily even being part of the conversation. You could see how close they were leaning in, how far. Were they gesticulating? What was happening with their eyes? Was I conscious of it at the time? Absolutely not. Wind the clock forward to 2008. I'm in a boardroom at Microsoft in Australia doing an intergalactic video conference with Seattle, Singapore, and Sydney. It was the annual budget process. And 20 minutes into this meeting, my vice president, sitting right across me in the boardroom, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Oscar, we need to talk immediately after this meeting." I don't know about you, Dov, but when somebody says that, like, honey, we need to talk, yeah, the outcome's not going to be great, is it?
Yeah, a little cringy.
The meeting finished at the 70-minute mark. And from the 20-minute mark to the 70-minute mark, ironically, I didn't listen to a word that was being said. What I was doing was writing down with a pen and paper and figuring out how many weeks of salary I've got left before I run out of cash. As I collected my laptop and writing equipment, I started to step out the door, and Tracy said, Oscar, please close the door because what I have to say is really important and it needs to be said in private. So I closed the door and I walked back, and she looked me in the eyes as I was about 5 steps from the door, and she said, you have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you? And I thought, awesome. I'm getting fired and I don't even know why. I sat down. She looked me straight in the eye and said, Oscar, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world. Now, honestly, that was the most profound example of listening in a corporate environment where someone was listening to me. Dov, in my head, this is what was going on. Woo-hoo, I haven't been fired. Listening? What's that about? I don't care. Unfortunately, because I didn't listen, I got a really big uplift in a growth part of my budget, and I was obsessed with fixing that. So that's 2 doors that I had to go through to get to where we are today on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the workplace.
So let's go back to the first one so that people have context. What does that mean? I mean, I've never heard that term before, werewolf jaw. Is that a colloquialism, or is that your idea, or is that actually what? I can't imagine a doctor signing a script that says, oh, you have werewolf jaw. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, that was the disparaging comments I would get at school from kids. And so werewolves are famous for having a very protruded jaw. They have very big bite. My front jaw was well in front of my back jaw. I'd call them fangs now. I wouldn't have said that at the time, but some of my teeth were much longer. They ended up getting pulled out. So it was a joke that the school kids made. They called me werewolf jaw. But what it meant was you could literally fit a fist between your front jaw and your back jaw, and it was completely malformed. And the only way to do that was to every 3 months tighten the screws and pull the front jaw back. I also learned I had a high tolerance for pain because they kept saying, do you want some painkillers to go home? And I go, oh, no, I'm okay. And my mum was very confused too.
That seems to me to have 2 levels of pain to it. It has the pain of the actual physical discomfort of, having to tighten it to change it, but also the emotional pain of being different. We all want to fit in. We all want to belong. And at the same time, this physical distinction that you're not like everybody else, like you said, that would push you into the background and made you a great person for asking questions. Was that what stood out to that person? I can't imagine that at the 20-minute mark, because you're leading this presentation, that you've actually turned it all into questions, or did you? Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, you've got to imagine the boardroom and the set piece of a budget setting process. It's very theatrical. Everybody's got their own position they want to fight for. The head office wants to stretch the growth in their subsidiary organizations. The subsidiaries want a realistic budget because if they don't get it right, people lose their jobs. Basically, if you don't set up a fair budget. Singapore's trying to be neutral. It's trying to be Switzerland and brokering something in between. You've got Seattle saying higher and Australia saying lower and Singapore trying to mediate. In the room in Australia, there's 12 people. In Singapore, there's 6. In Seattle, there's 9, and a whole bunch of supporting people in the background who are all business analysts with gas-powered spreadsheets trying to convert stuff in currencies and all sorts of stuff. What I said at the 20-minute mark that Tracy noticed was the meeting got very, my number's right, your number's wrong. So everybody's identity was wrapped up in their number, and they were there to fight for themselves. Because everybody's got constituent stakeholders that they have to go back to and explain the meeting. And I said, before we disclose a number, could we just unpack the 3 assumptions that went into making those numbers so we can have a transparent conversation about the assumptions as well as the numbers? Because a debate that says, your number's too high, your number's too low, well, that's not productive. What we learned very quickly was the comparisons they made about our GDP relative to peer markets and the mix of public sector versus commercial business wasn't the same assumptions we were making. So we started talking about the assumptions. Now, I mentioned it was a 70-minute meeting. It was scheduled for 2 hours because these meetings go often 3-4 hours, and they're the budget setting meetings. Once people had disclosed their assumptions, all of a sudden people would detach from my number and talk about the assumption. And they're okay to go, oh, okay, well, my assumption may be off. Let's calibrate now and see what does that line up with. And for a lot of us, when we're in debate, there are multiple assumptions we're not even conscious of as the speaker, let alone the listener. But if you are the listener, a couple of code words you'll hear: always, never. These words, these absolutes, are code words for you to go and listen and go, okay, always? Ask the people, do you literally mean always? Well, you know, Oscar, not always, but this is the situation I'm talking about. And they're unpacking their own assumption. That level of listening is helping you and them listening at the highest level, which is listening for meaning. And Dov, I know you talk a lot about leaders need to set the meaning so that the community can make the movement. And for many of us, we're not even listening at meaning. We're not listening at unsaid, which is level 4. You've helped everybody listen to context at level 3. Most people are at level 2 and level 1, which is content, what somebody says. And level 1 is listening to yourself. Most people aren't even there at listening. So to answer your specific question, it was declare your assumptions in that corporate context. Whether you're developing software or running a project or launching a new product, that simple act of helping to get the assumptions out will help to make it move faster, meet the customer expectations, or when you're recruiting somebody, when you can explore why did you leave your job or why do you want to leave your last job, you can unpack some of the assumptions that sit behind that.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I don't know anyone who consistently listens without assumptions. That takes a lot of work for most people to even do that because they don't even recognize they have assumptions. And what I mean by that is that I don't think most people have even asked themselves, what is the meaning I'm giving something, whatever that thing is. And if you don't know the meaning, you can't create healthy boundaries and you can't listen with a way to push things away that don't make sense or are irrelevant, as you were saying. You said the first level of it is people recognizing that they're not listening to themselves. You and I talked about this in our previous chat. Most people are listening with the intent to respond rather than listening to what's being said. And then they're listening to make sure that they get the words out, but they're actually not listening to themselves. I know you go into these 5 levels of listening. Can we just do a sort of overview of that so people get a grasp of that? I know that there's a lot more to it, and we're not going to be able to get to all of it in the show, but I want people to have a sense of it because it seems vast. I mean, we just think about listening. Hey, I'm listening. No.
Yeah, my wife says I could talk about listening for the rest of my life, and that's the plan. Which is ironic. I thought I could listen my way to 100 million listeners in the world, and then someone pointed out to me, hey, Oscar, if you want to get there, you probably have to improve your speaking. So ironically, in this whole 10-year journey so far, I've got better at speaking than I have at listening. My listening is definitely improved. Look, when it comes to listening, what I'm talking about is based on a research database we've collected of over 35,000 workplace listeners. I'm not pulling this out of my culo. If you speak Spanish, you'll know what that means, but I didn't want to get the beep in English language. What we ask people is 20 questions and then an open-ended question. What do you struggle with when it comes to listening? 63% of people in our database. So 6 out of 10 people use language and answer responses that said they can't even get in the conversation because they have so many browser tabs open up in their mind before they go into the conversation that their memory is literally overloaded. They're thinking about the last conversation, the next conversation, what they need to do for dinner tonight, pick up the kids, whatever it is. And for many of us, we're listening through a filter of these distractions. So what we do is we jump to conclusions. We try and fix the other person. We try and anticipate what they're going to say because we kind of get bored in our own head, and we kind of project the messiness in our own head back out to the other person. So for many of us, just knowing we're going to be distracted, 6 out of 10 of you, the younger you are, that number moves up to 7 out of 10. The older you are, moves down to 5 out of 10. But older people struggle with the mechanics of hearing, so they're at a disadvantage because hearing deteriorates with age as well. So when it comes to going to the conversation, and remember, the boundary conditions of all of this is workplaces. So please do not practice this with your loved ones at home. I don't want to be responsible for any divorces. Okay. This is just about work, working with your manager, working with your peers, working with your customers and suppliers. 3 really simple things to do is, 1, if you're in control of the meeting, meaning you can set up the meeting time, schedule the meeting for 5 minutes after the hour or 5 minutes after the half hour. Now, it's interesting what meaning people make of that, because I once had a client where I explained, I'm going to book it in 5 minutes after the hour because you're a busy executive and you're in back-to-back meetings. You haven't got time to go to the toilet, let alone get something to eat. And I want your headspace clear. Now, we did a debrief 4 meetings down the track, and they said, Oscar, when you said 5 minutes after the hour, this is what went through my head. This guy really values his time, but more importantly, he values my time. And because they had the 5 minutes, they always said, gee, Oscar, I really look forward to your meeting because I'm ready for it. Now, what's ironic is those people will normally turn up 5 minutes after the hour anyway. Hey, Dov, really sorry, had a back-to-back meeting. Just had to grab a glass of water, a cup of tea, a coffee, but I'm here, I'm ready now. And that state of mind, they're rushed, they're harried, they're not ready. Their browser tabs are still all open. Whereas if you declare to them, we're going to start at 5 minutes after the hour, they're ready for the conversation. So tip number 1, try that 5 minutes after the hour. And if you're booking an hour meeting, don't. Just make it 50 minutes. If you're booking the half-hour meeting, don't make it 20 minutes, because when both parties are ready to listen to each other, the meetings are shorter. Wouldn't we all like that?
That's very important.
I got 2 other tips at level 1.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I speculate you took some notes as you were going along. I'm curious what popped for you there.
Well, what I think is that a lot of the time people are listening in the way that you were at the 20-minute mark in that initial meeting you talked about at the beginning of the show, which is they're listening under threat. There's some threat they've made up in their mind, some meaning they've given that is threat-based, where they feel like, I'm going to get criticized, I'm going to get judged, I'm going to get X or Y. And when we do that, the cortisol levels in the brain go up. And when the cortisol levels in the brain go up, we can't listen. We don't have the ability to listen fully. We can listen, but we can't hear what's actually being said. And so I'm really wondering about that, because I think that a lot of people in the workplace are listening under threat. They're not even speaking without threat. So they're speaking, maneuvering around the potential threat in their head. So they're not aware of what they're actually trying to deliver. They're maneuvering the threat, and they're trying to maneuver and manipulate around the potential threat coming at them.
I'll touch on 2 concepts. The second tip is simply this: whether this is a one-on-one or a group meeting, whether you're the host or not, ask this question to every participant. What would make this a good conversation? Now, do not ask, what would make this a good conversation for you? That is not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is, imagine it's 2 people. Listening happens at the intersection of the 2 people. Listening is a third entity in the conversation that emerges when communication takes place, whether that communication is productive or unproductive. When we ask what would make it a good conversation, they will tell us possibly what they want to discuss, and usually how they want to discuss it as well. You do exactly the same thing. This then gives you a permission slip to check in roughly every 15 to 10 minutes and say, hey, Dov, at the beginning of the conversation, you said this will make it a good conversation. How are we going? When we ask that, it gives them a permission slip at the beginning, and it increases psychological safety, which is the issue you raised earlier on that said there's power differentials, there's all sorts of things that we're going to either talk about or not talk about or bring up. But if you ask a really neutral question, like what would make this a good conversation? What would make this a good meeting? What would make this a good project? It doesn't matter. What would make this a good conversation if you're in sales call? All of a sudden, the first thing the person goes is, wow, okay, haven't been asked that before. I'm going to stop because this question's going to make me think. I'm not going to be robotic. I'm actually going to have to pause. And then at the 10-minute mark, this person showed they were listening because they checked in and said, you said this, and how are we tracking? Now, in the Deep Listening Ambassador community, these 35,000 people we've researched, what we hear back is by using this question, 1 hour meetings typically get reduced by 25% and 20-minute meetings get reduced by about 7%, not as much in the shorter meetings. Wouldn't we all like shorter meetings? Now, in a group meeting, if you don't ask that question, what you'll do is you'll have 2 dominant participants talking and the rest of the room is basically wallflowers. They won't offer up anything because they don't know where to jump in. They don't know if their opinion's valued or not. By going around at the beginning of the meeting, again, we're setting context, that very important word you used earlier on. Why are we here? How would we like to progress? And what is the outcome we want to get to? Now, the last thing I want to mention is 3 numbers. If you know these numbers, you will understand why people don't speak up and say what they think, and more importantly, what they mean. If you can get people to say what they think and what they mean, you'll have shorter meetings, you'll have tighter relationships, you'll have loyalty that you mentioned very regularly, and you'll build a community inside your organization. First number. The first number is the speed at which people speak on average. On average, 125 to 150 words per minute. I speak a little slower. I take a few more pauses, but that's deliberate in specific contexts. If I'm auctioning a property, I may be speaking at 200 words per minute. You can still understand everything I say. That is because you can listen at 400 words per minute.
Wow.
Why do we know this? We know that sight impaired people have higher natural listening speeds than sighted people. How do we know this? Statistics from Audible and YouTube tells us people without sight play the videos back at higher speeds than sighted people. So when you're listening, there's the first problem. Let's say you listen at 200 words per minute. You're listening at double the speed at which I can speak at. So what do you do in the gap? You drift, you anticipate, you solve, you judge. There's a whole bunch of things going on. The third number is the most important. This number relates to the speaker. Although the speaker can speak at 125 words per minute, they can think at 900. Let me say that again. You can think at 900, you can speak at 125 to 150. That means that the first thing you say is 14% of what you think. When you say the first thing you say, you're getting 14% of the thinking. Now, keep in mind, you probably don't want everything I'm thinking. Should I have Vegemite on toast for breakfast this morning? Probably not important. But even if you halve that number, you're getting only 20% of what they're thinking. If you do advanced study, PhD, if you're very experienced in your field, at the edge of the bell curve, you can be thinking at 1,600 words per minute.
Wow.
That means the first thing you say may be 2% of what you're thinking. Now, one of the things I have is dyscalculia, which means I'm not really good at math. Thanks to a great manager who listened to me. I started off life as an audit clerk in an accounting firm, but they very quickly pointed out that my career would crash and I'd have to find a different career. Now, Dov, when you hear that massive differential between what I'm thinking and what I'm saying, is it any wonder people don't speak up? Because in their mind, they're rehearsing. Should I say it this way? Should I say that? Or should I say that? Or should I say that? Unless we feel like we're in a tribe where we belong, the likelihood of us speaking up with what matters, what's going to break the project, what's going to break the product, what's going to break the code of our culture inside our organization is pretty low. Now, for those of you who are listening on audio only, Dov's been nodding furiously at specific points and taking down notes. So I'm super fascinated, or in his words, curious about what he noticed when he was listening to those numbers.
Well, it was the numbers I found very interesting. I certainly am aware of other numbers in context of tone, speed, cadence, intonation, all those different things around speaking, which is the other side, and therefore whether somebody's actually hearing you, because if you are a visual versus an auditory learner, I know you talk a lot about that. So these numbers, though, around the processing, which was fascinating to me, the processing piece of it was really quite fascinating, because even if you're a great listener, you are still processing what's being said to you and at some degree working out what your response is, but you might be responding to something that in your head has already passed way ago. That is what's fascinating, and it really points out where miscommunication happens, because I'm responding to something that you're not even part of anymore. And if you're processing also at 1,600 words, it's using that, if you're processing at that speed, you don't know why I'm pissed off about the thing that you said way earlier, because you've already moved so far ahead. So it seems like we're so far ahead and so far behind each other that it seems like it would make communication almost impossible. So it's a bloody miracle that we can actually communicate anyway, based on the numbers you just delivered.
Yeah, and Oscar Wilde was quoted as saying the illusion of communication is that it actually takes place. And so one of the communities I work with is actuaries. These are people who do complex calculations inside insurance companies that calculate risk on fires in California, or how long will you live, or what sort of accident you might have in your car. They're highly rational, logical, numerate, sequential thinkers. I also work with a lot of software engineers, very deliberate, consistent. All of those require some kind of creativity, but because I worked in these communities, I had to express this in a mathematical formula and express it as a simultaneous equation, and they got it straight away because I was speaking into their context. For many of us, as you described that, it's a miracle how it all happens. That question at the beginning is your seatbelt to avoid a car crash in communication. The question is, what will make this a good conversation? Because no matter what happens in that distraction, the point you want to make, you come back in, you both should be checking in with each other. And when you do, you create a natural pause. It's a focus on the process, not the outcome. One thing good listeners are is curious. Another thing we know about them is they're flexible. And the final thing they are is open. So those three things play really well into checking in with our question regularly. It could be expressed with like, how are we tracking? At the beginning, you said this, how are we going?
Mm-hmm.
And it also gives us permission to change the course of the conversation completely, because in your insight there, Dov, you go, oh, well, I've got a completely different point. And it gives us an opportunity to go, for the balance of the conversation, could we focus differently on blah?
The thing I found really interesting to what you said was, because you said, don't do this at home, but I'm going to go the other way. Do this at home. Do this at home. How about in your conversation with your partner that you say, what would it take for this to be a good conversation? What would it take for this to really deliver as a conversation between us? Because again, most of us are presuming some kind of threat or attack. And so when your wife, your husband, your partner says to you, we need to talk, it's like, okay, well, that's not such a good thing. But that difference is in what would it take for this to be a great conversation says, let's take some of the attack out of this. And I really like that. For me, that piece there is so profound, is because it directly deals with the power differential. And the power differential, even in an equalized relationship between couples, is on who's most pissed off. The most pissed off person has the most power. And that's why people use anger to demonstrate their control. So it's very interesting. And I love that you've used that, because it's like, I'm really furious right now and I want to have this conversation with you, but what would have to happen for it to be a really positive outcome conversation? And the person can go, oh, all right. Suddenly that anger, frustration is kind of put to the side. I love that. We're already at the end of part 1 of the show, Oscar, and we're going to go into part 2. And I want to dig a little deeper into all of this and look at some of these, not just the 5 levels, but the things that get in the way of us listening. And you call them the 4 villains, I believe. I want to talk about those. Please tell people where they can find out more about you and all your wonderful resources.
Thanks, Dov. I'd rather you find out more about your listening. If you visit listeningquiz.com, you can answer 20 questions and discover what barriers get in the way of your listening and what's a secondary barrier that may get in the way of your listening as well. You get a 5-page report and it'll tell you what to do about it. We won't leave you hanging. We'll give you some practical tips that are tuned specifically to your listening style. So listeningquiz.com, best place to go.
Well, we're going to make sure that we post that in the show notes. You also have a podcast. Tell people where they can find the podcast and what's the name of it.
The Apple award-winning podcast is called Deep Listening, How to Have an Impact Beyond Words. And we interview everybody from deaf and blind people to judges and journalists, hostage negotiators, air traffic controllers, and dolphin trainers, people where listening matters really in their professions.
Beautiful. Well, again, we'll make sure that we post all of that in the show notes. We're going to be back in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.